This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the world. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/eyebrowcinema. What was the first horror movie you ever loved? This question was at the heart of a recent Twitter trend, where users were uploading selfies and horror movie posters with the caption, "The Horror Fan, the movie that made me." And this prompt stumped me for a while. I like horror movies a whole lot. I usually structure most of my October viewing around spooky-themed films, and I like to think I'm fairly well versed in the genre. But at the same time, I've never really been a horror guy. More than any genre, horror can inspire a real fanaticism and dedication, especially at a young age. But I didn't really watch horror movies as a kid. I liked horror-adjacent things like Tim Burton movies or Simpsons Halloween specials and heavy metal music, and I remember always loving Halloween as a concept, but truly scary movies were not really something I was exposed to. I don't think it was because my parents were concerned about violence. My dad certainly didn't hesitate to show me all manner of violent action films from a young age, but he was never much for horror either, so scary movies weren't part of that rotation. By the time I was 9 or 10 and old enough to start sort of seeking movies out for myself, the popular horror films were things like the Saw franchise, The Descent, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, which certainly weren't trying to reach me. Not just because the high levels of bloodshed probably would have made even my dad blush, but they also didn't really interest me. Mainstream horror in the 2000s didn't really focus on iconic monsters or fantastical elements that could draw kids in like there were in the 80s, 50s, or 30s. There were some exceptions, but the focus was more grounded, and to my eyes at the time, more boring. I did actually see the first Saw movie around when it first hit the movie network at a friend's house, and I remember liking it, but it certainly didn't leave much impression. Like a lot of horror movies we watched together on TV, it was just something to do while we hung out after school or on weekends or at a birthday party. They weren't the movies I obsessed over, or rented over and over again from the video store. It wasn't until I was 13 that I saw a horror movie which I really loved. And somewhat shockingly, it came from my non-horror loving father. See, it was around this time my dad started to introduce me to some of his favorite movies that were a bit more adult-oriented, and amidst the likes of Dogma and Pulp Fiction, there was something unexpected. David Cronenberg's 1986 classic, The Fly. The story of scientist Seth Brundle, whose DNA is crossed with a housefly and who slowly transforms into a grotesque monster, as his lover Veronica looks on in powerless horror. This was a shock to my system as a young teen, and I loved it. To say I had never seen anything like this movie would be a massive understatement. I had never seen a monster like Brundlefly. Monsters were the werewolf in Harry Potter or the ring wraiths in Lord of the Rings. At worst, they could be a little scary for a kid, but they weren't stomach-turningly revolting. Brundlefly was gross, dripping and gooey, creating a physical revulsion in me without compare. Add to that, he wasn't a static monster either. One of the great thrills of The Fly is seeing Seth evolve over the course of the story. The visual ingenuity of the makeup is certainly impressive, but on a deeper level, we never get used to the monster. The continuing degradation of Seth's body means we never have time to become desensitized to his monstrosity. Just when we think we have, his new developments unsettle and disturb all over again. That slow transformation is at the core of Cronenberg's film, and what distinguishes it from the 1958 version, where a scientist emerges from the teleporter, immediately a full-on fly monster. The audience maybe saved the reveal until Act 3, but all the same, there's a much simpler dichotomy of man and monster. With Cronenberg, however, there are layers of decline. That sense of decay further enhances the uncanny factor of Brundlefly. The uncanny refers to a sense of unease brought on by a combination of otherness and yet a strange familiarity. Monsters are a defining example of this, unnatural beings outside the bounds of life and death, yet also human-like in appearance and form. It is not the monster's inhumanity which is scary, but the intersection of the human and non-human. What makes Brundlefly such a fascinating manifestation of the uncanny is the way that intersection changes over the course of the story. Seth begins the film not at all monstrous, but entirely human and relatable. Once Seth's DNA is crossed with a fly in the teleporters, though, he becomes tainted by otherness, and over time, that other overtakes and overwhelms his humanity. And yet, even when the other is so strong that a human actor is no longer involved in the performance, I still recognized lingering traces of Seth's humanity in Brundlefly. The real terror is knowing there's still something human within the monster. That is, in part, a testament to Chris Wallace and the special effects team, who really make this creature feel alive. But it is equally the accomplishment of Cronenberg and the performers, who craft such an empathetic and moving portrait of love and loss that the climactic confrontation is as tragic as it is terrifying. I wasn't alone in finding such poignancy in The Fly. Cronenberg himself noted his surprise that film critics in 1986 largely praised such a violent and repulsive piece of horror filmmaking. Particularly prominent were readings of the film which saw Seth's monstrousness as a metaphor for AIDS, centering on the film's intermingling of sex, science, and physical deterioration. As a 13-year-old largely ignorant to the AIDS crisis, I wasn't picking up on these references, but I did understand that, at its simplest level, The Fly was a movie about dying.
What's happening to me? Am I dying?
I'd seen stories of men transformed into horrific beasts all through childhood, but almost always there was a cure, or at the very least, the condition was manageable. But the underlying terror of The Fly is the slow realization that there is no cure or control. That for all Seth's brilliance, his rage, his desperate, frantic pleading, he cannot stop what's happening to him. I certainly couldn't have put it into words at 13, but I think it was this mix of emotional depth and existential dread that really resonated with me. Before The Fly, I didn't really take horror movies very seriously. They were breezy watches to provide some temporary thrills while having some laughs with friends. The Fly was different.
Now the dream is over, and the insect is awake.
This was a movie that pulled me in with rich characters and layered performances. A movie where the scares were not just momentarily thrilling, but lingered in my mind long afterwards. In the years since that first viewing, I'd continued to be drawn to stories of body horror, and David Cronenberg in particular is still my favorite horror director.
Get the Videodrome! Long live the new flesh!
Even when not strictly working in the genre, Cronenberg's films delve into the darkest aspects of the human personality and the body as a site of desire and revulsion. More broadly, though, The Fly opened my mind to the possibilities of horror. That horror cinema could tell some of the most affecting, personal, and profound stories that would make me rethink my own sense of self. That the aesthetics of horror brought unique and original ways of telling stories in the first place. And most important of all, that a scary movie could be one of my favorite movies. So here's to the horror fan and the movie that made me. Thank you to Mubi for sponsoring this video. Mubi is a curated streaming service where you can watch some of the most beautiful and incredible works of cinema from around the world. Every day, Mubi premieres a new film. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. And these movies don't come from a faceless algorithm, but are hand-picked by actual human beings. It's like your own personal film festival, streaming anytime, anywhere. If you're watching in North America, I'd especially like to recommend George A. Romero's seminal classic, Night of the Living Dead. Longtime viewers of Eyebrow cinema should be well aware how much I love this movie, and it's a perfect watch for Halloween season. mixing the fun of movie monsters with a no-holds-barred, unrelenting terror. And the best part, you can watch it and a whole host of amazing cinema for free right now. Just head to mubi.com/eyebrowcinema for a free 30 days. That's a whole month of great cinema for free.